Good morning. I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Mignone and the Center for Italian Studies here at Stony Brook for the invitation to be part of today's celebrations. I would also like to thank Joe Fusco and Donna Severino for all of the hard work that they did in organizing this event. What brings me here today is the desire to share preliminary results to a question that I think has implications for academic research even beyond the study of Galileo. And I think it may respond in part to the comments that we heard in the last session. The question is, what mutual benefit can be found in the intersection of literary historical studies with digital and computational studies? The most facile answer is efficiency. But we all know that even the most efficient reader can quickly read the wrong texts, can ask the wrong questions of them, or ultimately draw the wrong conclusions. After all, who are the Lothario Sarsi, ridiculed by Galileo in the Saggiatore, and the Aristotelian character Simplicio, of his later dialogues, if not personifications of those very intellectual blunders? So in my remarks this morning, I'm going to move in 4 stages. I'll start by framing what's at stake in this question. I'll outline the types of data that I'm using to answer it. I'll offer you some examples of what's possible with that data, and finally suggest some very tentative conclusions about this relationship between Galileo and digital studies. First, the question of mutual benefit between literary historical studies and digital studies is a broad one indeed. So today, I'm going to focus only on the study of Galileo's library as one example of a literary historical field. And while I'm defining my terms, I think it is important to note that by digital study, I mean processes that are occurring within a computer, scanning a text into memory, parsing, chunking, collating, storing, comparing, searching, and all of those functions that a programmer would type into a command line. By computational, I mean quantifying qualitative data or using quantified data and conducting analyses in an algorithmic fashion. Now, I think seeing the digital and the computational at work is much easier in the sciences, and for that reason, I'm projecting these images of surface density of the moon that were released earlier this month by NASA. The Gravity Recovery and Interior Laboratory, or the GRAIL mission, great acronym there, was able to digitally track gravity gradients in the moon's surface and subsurface structures that are suggestive of ancient rift valleys, so the reds and blues that you see in the far right image. This data was collected digitally by measuring the changes in relative velocity of 2 spacecraft that were orbiting the moon in nearly the same pattern. That speed was then translated computationally into these stunning visualizations of the changing density of materials that shape the lunar body. So my satellites are library databases and Galileo's texts in digital format. My computation is far more elementary, counting, mapping, and connecting right now. In the case of the NASA GRAIL study, the value is apparent immediately, I think, and I hope to successfully demonstrate that the same is true for Galileo's library. So let me speak a little more to why this project is worth pursuit. The reason that I'm asking this question lies more at the core of intellectual investigation than merely being able to read or calculate more things more quickly. Digital humanists and data scientists have already established the parallel between themselves and Galileo in varying degrees of profundity and consistency. Galileo is everywhere in digital studies. At least so it would seem from the number of times that he and his telescope appear or are mentioned in analogy with the digital turn in the study of art, literature, history, social sciences, health sciences, and all of the other fields into which the term data has seeped. Scholars in the digital and computational world apply the telescope metaphor in 2 ways. The data itself is like the telescope, or the algorithms are. For example, an example of the former. In the introduction to their 2013 book, Uncharted, Big Data as a Lens on Human Culture, Erez Aydin and Jean-Baptiste Michel make this comparison. Like the telescope, big data provides a new kind of optics, they say, through which to view the world in a field of larger breadth than previously imagined. They frame their investigation as a search for, and this is the first quote, a kind of scope that, instead of observing physical objects, would observe historical change. So Galileo is most frequently presented in these kinds of digital humanities texts because he's seen as the exemplary maker of a tool that revolutionized the way mankind could investigate the previously invisible structures governing events in the world. You can see how Aydin and Michel are also exemplary of kind of slippery metaphors because they change their comparison. In the second quotation, they say science and the humanities are becoming once again kindred spirits. And just as Galileo transformed our understanding of our world in the 17th century, these two lenses, back to back, will do the same in the 21st. Now, I think and I hope that the evidence I offer today will show that the potential benefit of a double lens, if you'll permit me to carry that slippery metaphor forward, is more than just an efficient tool that's operating at a new scale. And let me say a bit on what I do hope to achieve. In an essay for Debates in the Digital Humanities, Willard McCarty, who's a leader in the field, expresses an anxiety that perhaps the transformational potential of computing hasn't quite reached that of the telescope in the 17th century yet. And he paraphrases one of the founders of the discipline of the digital humanities, Father Roberto Busa, who had great expectations for computation. He writes saying that the computer was not primarily meant to be a labor-saving device to be used to free scholars from drudgery, but a means to illumine ignorance by provoking us to reconsider what we think we know. And it's that final phrase that truly frames my talk, the capacity of these tools and their data to provoke us to reconsider what we think we know. And I think it's that resonates most closely with Galileo's own endeavors, using the telescope to force us to rethink the structure of the universe. So with the question properly framed, I'll turn to the second portion of my talk, the data. I'm taking as the object of study for now the collection of books and manuscripts that at any given time were likely part of Galileo's library. This comes with many caveats. I could spend the next 20 minutes going through the caveats of books and historic book collections, but the most important ones to point out are that just because he owned a book, it does not mean that he read it, nor does it mean that he himself bought it. Now, I also realize that the question of the books that Galileo owned carries with it an inherent tension. The telescope is a technology for what Galileo called the world of the senses, which stands in constant opposition to the world on paper. The quote that I have provided from a translation of the beginning of the second day of the dialogue on the chief world systems dramatizes this epistemological point, that in the new methodology of natural philosophy, conclusions should be confirmed by observations, not by books. Perhaps that is why the question of Galileo's personal library has fascinated me for so long, going on 10 years now. What role did books play in the shaping of this new epistemology? In large part, the collection of Galileo's books was defined by Antonio Favaro before he began work on the national edition of Galileo's Opere, and this is in the last decade of the 19th century. But his body of research in this area has remained largely unquestioned and also unused since then. There are half a dozen or so exceptions to this that I'd be happy to talk about. In broad strokes, Favaro published a series of 3 articles in which he identified titles of printed books mentioned in Galileo's correspondence and in the inventories of inheritances of his son and his daughter-in-law. Favaro admits that he was primarily searching for exemplars with Galileo's marginalia, which to some extent defines the strengths but also the weaknesses of the final product. He identified 537 unique titles, or unique entries, some don't have titles, in his idealized catalog, with varying degrees of bibliographic specificity. So I'll just give you 2 examples, and I'll read them out because I realize the print is small. In the top right, entry 381 says Arcadia del Sanazzaro, and that's it. The note explains that there were more than 20 editions of the work in the 16th century alone, so it's not possible to know which one Galileo owned. Entry 382, just below it, is far more specific, but it's indicative of the same problem. It says L'Amadigi di Bernardo Tasso in Vineggia per Gabriel Giolito, 1560. The source that Favaro provides, that little S in brackets there, is an inventory of the books that were under the stairs in Galileo's daughter-in-law's home. That document, if you trace it back, says only L'Amadigi del Tasso. It says nothing of the Venetian edition of 1560. There were just a few editions circulating in Galileo's lifetime of L'Amadigi, but Favaro explains in the introduction that he was relying on the collection of the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Firenze to determine the specific editions for many works in Galileo's collection, operating on the assumption that Galileo's collection did not travel far after its dispersal. Now, this is true for the cluster of books that passed to Vincenzo Viviani, but I imagine, and Viviani's library is a testament to this, that Viviani was not very interested in epic poems like L'Amadigi, let alone L'Arcadia di Sanazzaro. The tenuous claim about the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale catalog being the determining factor for these editions, And the fact that Favaro's notes are mostly uncatalogued and inaccessible at the Domus Galileiana in Pisa right now have led me to a thorough re-examination of these source materials, the G, the S, the F that you see in the brackets there. By also incorporating research completed 2 years ago by Michele Camerotta on manuscripts, I'm now working with a presumed collection of 673 titles. About half of them are in this uncertain category of Sanazzaro and Bernardo Tasso, where we only know a title or an author, but being able to precisely say 1560 Venice is another question. The good news is that there is another half of the library for which we can identify, we can essentially triangulate using many resources, those specific editions. Now, I emphasize this distinction between the two halves because a comprehensive analysis of Galileo's library, to me, should include as many books presumed to be in the collection as possible. And yet, computation requires a degree of certainty in the data that physical books resist in many ways. So as I move into the third segment of my remarks, I'm going to focus on 3 characteristics of books: the time and the place that they were published, and the network of people and places that a book represents. And I'd be happy to talk about text as a characteristic as well after. So I apologize that this is small, but really the color coding will help demonstrate the trends. I'm happy to show larger images on my laptop after. What you see here is a histogram of the publication years for editions of books known to have been in Galileo's library. They're color-coded by important periods before and during his lifetime. Vertical lines that you see indicate important events in his life to help distinguish these. On the far left, the brown, this is the period before Galileo's birth. The books range from 0 to 3 over a course of about 75 years. To the right of that, the light blue section, these are during Galileo's youth while his father was alive. In red, the few years that he was at Pisa. In purple, the years at Padua. In green, we have the Florentine years between when the Sidereus Nuncius was published and the trial by the Inquisition. And then the yellow on the far right are is the final decade of Galileo's life. Now, this collection neatly covers 150 years, but given these many early years in the brown period without coverage, the median value for publication in this collection is 1614. Slightly later than the mode year of 1612, itself only slightly higher than the mean value of 1608. So we're working in the transition moment is that period when the Starry Messenger is published. The most striking observation about this data set is the apparent emphasis on book collecting that occurred in the last 3 decades of Galileo's life. This is the same period in which we know that he was articulating a philosophical methodology based less on close readings of philosophical texts and more on experience, the senses, and the physical world. Now, this tension is only partially resolved by considering that owning ultra-contemporary books in the green and yellow period suggests participation in a lively dialogue in print, rather than poring over pages of inherited knowledge. Now, I'll say more on that aspect in the context of networks in a moment. But the histogram, to me, really shows the earliest that Galileo could have acquired a book, or that his father could have added the book to his own collection that Galileo inherited in 1591. Just because a book was printed in a given year does not mean that Galileo received it in that same year. And I think Nick's talk will also mention the forgeries of such books. So my example is an edition, a 1555 edition of Dante's Divina Commedia. It's actually the first edition that calls the comedy divine. Printed as it was in 1555, it theoretically could have belonged to Galileo's father, and it appears in that brown period before Galileo's birth in the histogram that we just saw. But thanks to a recent private exhibit in Rome, where this book surfaced in 2012, and thanks to the lovely dedication from Orazio Morandi that we see on the left, we know that this book was actually sent to Galileo as a gift in 1624. This kind of precision, where we can say a 1555 book entered the collection in 1624, if it ever arrived, right, all of those caveats, that kind of precision is only possible with a few titles in the entire collection. So it raises the question of to what extent publication dates on their own can reveal any patterns of collecting if what we can determine is just the earliest that Galileo could have acquired a book. The question of where a book was published raises other problems related to context. So what you see on the map is, are the publication locations of editions of books known to have been in Galileo's library. So again, we're still dealing with that precise half. The size of the blue icon is relative to the number of times that the city appears in the collection. And you can see on the bottom right a placeholder for Kormopoli, located for now as a placeholder at Kosmopoli, because Kormopoli was used as a false imprint location. So the books are also not consistently telling us where they were published, so we can't take them, many of them, at their word. But how do we map that if we know that it's a false location? By putting it, the power of the visual is so compelling that if we put that dot on a map, it looks like a book came from that place. That, in analysis, becomes more misleading. Seeing the distribution, in spite of those hiccups with the data, seeing the distribution of publishing sites represented by the known half of the library reinforces the assumption that Galileo would have shopped for local books in the places where he lived or that he visited frequently: Florence, Padua, Venice, and Rome. And these are also the places where the people with whom he was in dialogue were working and publishing. At the same time, seeing the data on a map makes clear how far certain volumes were traveling to reach him. Were they traveling so far because they were only published once in a smaller printing center? What choice did Galileo have? What choices did friends or colleagues have when they were selecting books to send to him? What emerges when this geographic data is combined with the knowledge about the range of years in which these editions were published is a more complete sense of the book choices that Galileo and his contemporaries faced. And I think that context of choice is a collection of data that perhaps speaks more directly to the question of what his library represents. And posing the question in this manner allows for the incorporation of most of the available information about Galileo's books, not just those mentioned in enough detail to identify a specific edition. Because if we look at something like Sanazzaro, we at least know what kind of choice Galileo had if he wanted a copy of the Arcadia. So let me use the example of Francesco Berni. He was one of Galileo's favorite poets, and he illustrates quite well the need for more inclusive data and the immediate challenges that arise from considering aggregate geographic and temporal information in this representation of the library. Galileo's friends mention his love of Berni's poetry many times in letters, and early biographers like to highlight that Galileo memorized much of his work. But no primary or secondary source indicates which, if any, of Berni's books might have been in the library. You'll have to pardon the anachronistic image here of a 1725 edition of Berni's Rifacimento, his remaking of Boiardo's Orlando Innamorato. And the Innamorato is the epic poem that Ariosto continued in the Orlando Furioso, which we know to have been one of Galileo's favorites. The problem of finding a sufficient placeholder of a cover page, even just for this talk, is quite apropos of the problem that Berni creates for computing the library. For me, suggesting any kind of representation of Galileo's book collection seems irresponsibly incomplete without somehow incorporating the work of a poet and a playwright who was so important to Galileo that he took the time to memorize portions of the text, recite them to friends, and get comments back from colleagues about them. Berni's work existed in 37 discrete editions in Galileo's lifetime that have arrived to us today. In order to represent the geographic and chronological variability represented by these editions, I've turned to the visualization of isotope behavior in chemistry as a model and as a heuristic for thinking through book isotopes, I'm calling them. So instead of charting protons and neutrons and stability, my chart of Berni's early modern book isotopes is going to track the range of publishing sites, the years a title was in print, and the number of volumes that correspond to those characteristics. And here's an example of this. And I realize in the back, I'll point out the lines of data that are here, because this is an example of how this might appear using the information about Berni's work. The scatter plot we see is showing, at least the city's label is rendering well here. It shows publication location charted over time on the x-axis, so the number of years, and this range is the same range that we saw in the histogram covered by Galileo's library. The data points are nicely color-coded. We see blue for 2 works, purple for 1 work, and this yellow dot, which I imagine will be impossible to see right now, is actually 4 works published in Florence. I think this scatter plot is also nicely indicative of a genetic gel test as well. Right? We're looking at Berni's early modern book identity in these dots. Now, as might be expected, Berni's publishing starts in Venice quite intensely, just as he dies, and then picks up in intensity the decade after his death. Interest moves to Florence, which is this line here, and continues again for about another decade. And when we get to the year of Galileo's birth, we see that there are only 4 reprints of Berni's works after that. When considered in comparison to the scatter plot of data about known editions in Galileo's library, the Berni data reveals the reason why relying on certain data, that just half of that collection, is misleading and unsatisfactory for describing the book collection. Because what you see here is the distribution of the known editions in Galileo's library. Again, we've got by publishing site, so we've got French and German cities at the top. Italian cities make up pretty much this middle half here. And then we get into Austria, the Paesi Bassi, the lowlands. We've got, and then this one line for unknown, where we know at least a publisher or we know a year, but we don't know both. Berni does not fit this trend. The half of the library for which we can specify a time and place of publication tends to be in Florence in later decades, right? So it reflects, here's Florence. It reflects Florence, the map, right? This emphasis on Venice, Rome, Florence. There's a little bit of Bologna there. And later in Galileo's life, so this portion that we saw in the histogram. So they are corresponding. But in almost every case, the data related to Berni fills a void in the data for editions in the library for which we have that complete information. So if I If I toggle back to Berni, right, we can see his cluster of information. When I move forward to look at the entire, when I move forward to look at the entire collection, we see that Berni exists in a void in that known part of the collection. This comparison emphasizes the need for and the value of seeing every book as a choice, not just those for which specific edition information can't be determined, so the Arcadias, for example. The differences in the two scatter plots also identify the need for additional texture related to all of the available information about the library. Since place and time are so slippery, what else can we add to better understand this collection? One way to visualize these dimensions of the data is to consider the book as a network. It's a network of people and places. I'll continue with the Berni example before I look at the library as a whole, just to explain a bit what I mean by a network. So what you see here is a network diagram of the ways in which Berni's books are connected to people and places. Berni himself sits at the middle of this little micro network. If his work was published in Venice, there's a line out to Venice and a node or a dot for Venice. We see Florence here, the emphasis on those cities where we know 11 editions were published. We see different publishers, we see different co-authors, and he sits at the center. He's the most connected person in this microsystem because we're focused on Berni himself. We see the importance of Florence and Venice because right now I have this visualized so that the more times a work of Berni is connected to a place, the thicker that line becomes. Every other element in this network is only related to the other elements by virtue of being co-occurring in an edition of Berni's work. Now what surprises me is what happens when we look, and this is just working with metadata. This isn't working with textual analysis right now. When we create a network graph of the metadata related to the people and places represented by the books that Galileo owned, I'll walk you through this. Something surprising happens. Now I visualize this slightly differently in order to reduce clutter, and as you can see, it's already a very cluttered constellation of books and people and places. The difference is that instead of the thickness of the line representing the number of connections, the size of the dot and the size of the label represents the number of connections. Now, we see what we would expect as far as geography translating into this network. Venice, most important, or the most common publishing site for Galileo, for books in Galileo's library. Florence, the second most. Rome, Padua. Since this is a detail of that network graph, we don't see Bologna, but it would be not as large as Galileo himself. And that's why I visualized it in this way, so that it's easy to see that after geography, Galileo is the most important proper noun, the most important person to appear in his own library. And why is that surprising? For a lot of reasons. He's there. He's more connected than Aristotle. He's more connected than Ptolemy. He's more connected than Kepler, the various Jesuit authors with whom he was in dialogue, even with Fortunio Laicetti, who I think 17 of Laicetti's works show up with relative certainty in Galileo's collection, right? He's the most prolific author in Galileo's personal library. What this suggests to me is that Galileo was able to witness and collect his impact on print culture in his own lifetime, or that whoever was curating his library for him during this period was witnessing and collecting as it was happening this push in print culture, not Berni, who only saw his influence on print culture a decade or 2 decades or even 3 decades after his death. Yes, Galileo wrote a fair number of books that were printed, but this suggests a deeper embeddedness of Galileo's works and ideas in print culture at the time. These are not results that I'm going to send to press just yet, because the result is a provocation, returning to my original idea. It's a provocation to revisit the data, to keep thinking about metadata and aggregating this information about choice, reconsider the visualization to make sure that I can trust what's coming out of my new telescope, right? And then recontextualize these implications. So my approach to the people, places, and time represented by the books in the library is very slowly trying to account for this broader context in which Galileo or other early modern readers would have encountered these books. So where does this leave us? Other than at the final portion of my talk, at some preliminary conclusions. At the beginning, I mentioned the power of those 2 lenses, that slippery metaphor, science and the humanities, or understood alternatively, large data sets and algorithms. Those areas greatly increase the possibilities of expanding Favaro's monumental work. Morandi's gift of Dante surfaces and adds granularity to this study, at the same time that contextual data is available and widely growing. More importantly is the ability of this work to make us, or at least me, rethink what is already known. Thinking about these early modern books as a data point changes our understanding of the dynamism of those books and book ownership. Moreover, I think these results urge us to reconsider Galileo's role in print culture beyond what made it into his library as we understand it today, and perhaps to compare it to the trends of others in the period and later. Great work has been done on Copernicus's library, on Tasso's library, so there's a lot of comparative study to be done here as well. And I realize that my remarks are omitting a branch of necessary discussion, which is Galileo's own application of computation and mathematics to his intellectual questions, which was nicely addressed. Essentially, my bibliography was that first panel. So in turn, all of this will help us to better understand the impact of this figure, who we continue to celebrate 450 years after his birth. Thank you.